Catherine, Princess of Wales, is holding more real power inside the British monarchy right now than almost anyone is willing to say out loud. And buried inside a claim that's currently flooding your feed is a story the people pushing it are counting on you not to question.
With Catherine continue to inspire, she combined an unerring ability to see the best in people.
This sounds credible precisely because something genuine is shifting around Catherine. But what's actually being sold to you? This is the moment King Charles signed an emergency decree, and Catherine now holds sole authority over the crown jewels. In June and July 2026, near-identical versions of this story appeared across multiple YouTube channels within days of each other. Same claim about sole guardianship, zero primary documentation attached to any of them, not one entry anywhere in the London Gazette, which is where real royal instruments are publicly recorded without exception. But here's the genuinely interesting part. The story didn't come from nothing. It was built, deliberately and carefully, on a scaffolding of real facts, real anxiety about Charles's health, real shifts in Catherine's institutional role, real questions about the monarchy's future. None of it individually sounds alarming. Collectively, it was assembled into something that isn't true. So the question worth asking is, what does a real royal decree actually look like? Because that answer exposes everything. When King Charles genuinely stripped Prince Andrew of his titles in November 2025, the mechanism was precise, public, and traceable. The London Gazette published the exact wording, letters patent under the Great Seal of the Realm, dated 3 November 2025, declaring that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shall no longer hold the style or attribute of Royal Highness. A second entry confirmed his removal from the peerage as Duke of York, with immediate effect, named, dated, attributed to a specific legal instrument, publicly recorded without exception. That is what real royal power looks like when it moves. Now compare that to the Catherine Decree. No London Gazette entry exists, no letters patent, no counter-signature from the Lord Chamberlain, nothing filed, nothing published, nothing traceable to any office inside or outside Buckingham Palace. That absence isn't a detail, it's the entire story. These instruments cannot be hidden. That is genuinely the point of the Gazette system. Real transfers of royal authority are constitutionally required to be publicly recorded. A secret emergency decree granting sole guardianship of the crown jewels would be, by definition, legally impossible under the framework governing how royal power actually transfers. So whoever assembled this story either didn't know that or counted on you not knowing it. But here's what makes this more interesting than simple fabrication. The story didn't invent everything from thin air. It needed real facts to survive, and the real facts it chose to build on are genuinely worth examining. Now, here's the thing about a fabrication that actually works. It doesn't build on nothing. It builds on something real, something verified, something you already half know. And then it stretches that real thing just far enough that the join becomes invisible. And the real thing this story chose to build on is Charles's cancer diagnosis. In January 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer following a separate procedure for an enlarged prostate. The specific type was not disclosed publicly. What was confirmed? Charles began treatment immediately, stepped back from most public-facing duties, and the palace issued regular updates through official communications that is documented and real. The treatment timeline ran publicly through the first half of 2024 before Charles resumed a reduced schedule, creating an extended window of genuine public uncertainty about the king's capacity. He missed engagements, substitutions were made, counselors of state were activated. None of that is invented. All of it is verifiable. But here's what actually happened next. That verified uncertainty, that real documented reduction in Charles's public duties, quietly became the raw material for something else entirely. The fabrication parasites onto the timeline, the hospital visits, the reduced schedule, the palace health bulletins, and uses them as atmospheric scaffolding. It doesn't need to prove the decree exists. It just needs you to already believe Charles is diminished. The real facts do that work for free. So when a script says Charles collapsed, or that doctors convened in secret, or that something was signed at midnight, it is grafting invented drama directly onto confirmed medical reality. Nothing was invented in a vacuum. Everything was deliberately attached to something true. That's what makes it harder to dismiss on instinct, and easier to believe than it deserves. But even granting all of that scaffolding, there's still a fundamental problem with the core claim. Because the crown jewels have a custodial structure that no individual royal can simply be handed by decree. So who actually controls them? And here's where the claim completely falls apart. Because the crown jewels are not a possession any individual royal can be handed, the custodial structure around them is institutional, layered, and deliberately designed to be beyond the reach of any single person's signature. Sources who understand how the royal household actually operates are clear on this. The physical custody of the crown jewels sits with Historic Royal Palaces, the independent charity that manages the Tower of London. Day-to-day care falls under the Master of the Jewel House, a formal position inside the Lord Chamberlain's office. When the jewels need to be moved, for a coronation, for a state opening, for anything, the authority to release them is exercised by the Comptroller of the Lord Chamberlain's office, who signs a voucher on physical receipt. That chain of custody is institutional. It does not run through Catherine. It does not run through any Princess of Wales. Now, the concept of sole guardianship being granted to an individual royal by personal decree, that is not a power that legally exists. You cannot sign it into being. There is no mechanism in the Crown Estate's framework, no instrument under the Great Seal, no precedent in the entire documented history of the royal collection that allows a single royal family member to assume exclusive custodial authority over the jewels by executive fiat. So what the fabricated decree is actually claiming is something the British constitutional framework has never permitted and was never built to permit. That is not a technicality. That is the core collapse of the story. But here is what genuinely does exist. Catherine's institutional power has been quietly, deliberately, and verifiably expanding since 2024, and the real version of that story is actually remarkable. So what has Catherine actually been granted? Start with the formal appointment. In November 2022, Parliament passed the Regency Act amendment that added Catherine to the list of Councillors of State alongside her husband William. This was not ceremonial. Councillors of State are the individuals legally empowered to carry out certain official functions of the monarch when the sovereign is incapacitated or abroad. Sources confirm that since Charles's cancer diagnosis became public in February 2024, that appointment has carried real operational weight rather than sitting quietly on paper, and the shift in her public schedule since 2024 is verifiable. In 2023, Catherine carried out approximately 130 official engagements. In the first 8 months of 2025, following her own cancer treatment and return to duties, the palace quietly restructured her diary in a way sources describe as deliberately strategic. Solo engagements increased. She was no longer positioned as a complement to William's schedule. She was positioned as a principal. But here is the specific appointment the fabrication seems to be distorting most directly. In early 2025, Catherine was formally associated with several patronages previously held by senior royals now stepping back. Among them, roles connected to the Royal Collection Trust and cultural heritage institutions. These are not crown jewels guardianship. They are not executive authority over state property, but they do represent a genuine institutional footprint that the clickbait machine has inflated beyond recognition. So the question becomes, why inflate it? The genuine story is already remarkable. A woman who spent 2024 navigating chemotherapy while her father-in-law navigated his own cancer diagnosis, and who emerged from that period with a demonstrably expanded institutional role. That is real. That is documented. Sources suggest the fabricated version exists precisely because the real version lacks the cinematic moment. There is no midnight signing. There is no single decree. There is something slower and arguably more durable. A palace quietly repositioning its next generation of principals through accumulated appointments, expanded patronages, and operational trust built under pressure. The fabrication needs a document. The reality does not. And that distinction matters. Which brings us to William. Because the story does not just elevate Catherine, it specifically frames William as excluded, asked twice to attend, refused both times. And that detail, sources say, is where the entire narrative architecture starts to genuinely collapse. Now, the fabrication doesn't just need Catherine elevated, it needs William diminished. That is a specific narrative choice, and sources suggest it is not accidental. The claim is precise. Charles refused William's presence twice, asked twice, turned away twice. It is the kind of detail that feels emotionally authentic because it maps onto a real tension people already believe exists. Father and son, the king and his heir, the old reign and the next one. But here is what makes this structurally incoherent. Since early 2023, Charles and William have been genuinely, documentably aligned in public positioning, joint engagements, coordinated messaging around the coronation, a deliberate, visible effort to project continuity. It was the palace's explicit answer to years of reported friction. The succession framework makes the locked-out framing even harder to sustain. William, as Prince of Wales, is already embedded in formal transition planning. His Counselor of State status, his intelligence briefings, his expanding institutional footprint, none of that disappears because a king signs a private document at midnight. The constitutional architecture does not work that way, and yet the fabrication needs him excluded. Because a story where William is included, informed, and aligned is not a story, it is a Tuesday, so he gets removed from the room twice, a detail that is impossible to disprove and completely unsourced, which raises the next question. If William is allegedly locked out, where exactly does Camilla fit? Now, the fabrication needs a villain, and that villain, sources suggest, is Camilla, not because she's done anything verifiable, but because the story requires someone to lose. The script positions her as completely shut out of the Midnight Decree, quietly stripped of influence, deliberately sidelined by a king who chose his daughter-in-law over his own wife. It is a compelling image. It is also genuinely unsupported by her actual constitutional position. Here is what that position actually is. Camilla became queen consort upon Charles's accession in September 2022 and was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey in May 2023. Her role carries no legislative power, but her ceremonial and institutional standing is not decorative. She chairs patronages, represents the crown at formal engagements, and sits within the official royal household structure by right of marriage to the sovereign. None of that can be erased by a private midnight document, because constitutionally, there is nothing to sign away. But here is why the fabrication works on audiences. Lingering public skepticism about Camilla's legitimacy is real and documented. Polling consistently shows she remains the least popular senior royal. That residual distrust is exploitable. The story does not need to prove she was removed. It only needs audiences to find removal plausible. So she gets erased from the room. No mechanism and gazette entry, just absence presented as humiliation, which raises the obvious question. If the erasure contains no evidence, how does the story feel so convincing? The answer is in the details themselves. And here is what the previous chapters have been quietly building toward. The story does not feel convincing despite lacking evidence. It feels convincing because of the specific way the lack of evidence is dressed. Every fabrication follows the same structural move. It replaces sourcing with granularity. Sources say Charles signed the decree at midnight, a timestamp so precise it implies someone was in the room with a clock. But precision and evidence are not the same thing. They just perform the same psychological function. The asked twice detail works identically. Charles reportedly refused William's presence, not once, but twice. That specific repetition suggests a pattern was documented. A witness counted. A record exists. It suggests, genuinely, the texture of a real account. But a fabricator can type asked twice in 4 seconds. The specificity costs nothing to invent and everything to disprove. Then there are the 3 words. Catherine said 3 words when handed authority. That level of granularity implies a named witness close enough to hear and precise enough to remember. The hidden doctors meeting operates on the same principle. A meeting no record exists for, but somehow precisely reconstructed. The hiddenness is doing the work. Unverifiable events cannot be falsified, which makes them infinitely usable. This is the precision illusion. Individually, each detail reads like corroboration. Collectively, they construct the impression of an evidentiary chain where no chain exists. Nothing is sourced. Everything feels sourced. And that distinction, sources suggest, is not accidental. It is the craft, which raises the next question. If the illusion is this transparent when examined, why does it spread so fast? That answer is not about the content at all. Now here is the part none of the fabricators want you to think about too carefully, because once you understand why the story spreads, the content itself becomes almost irrelevant. The June and July 2026 period created what sources describe as a perfect news vacuum. Charles's treatment schedule had reduced his public appearances, no major royal events were filling the calendar, and the algorithm had a gap to fill. Royal health crisis content consistently outperforms almost every other non-political category in both metrics. Viewers click because the stakes feel real. They stay because the precision illusion performs the function of a documentary. And here is where the psychology matters. Audiences do not consciously choose to believe fabricated content. They experience it as plausible. That is a completely different cognitive state. Plausibility does not require evidence. It requires familiarity, and royal decline narratives are genuinely familiar. Diana, the Queen, Charles's own diagnosis. The template exists in real memory. So when a new title arrives with midnight timestamps and 3-word verdicts and hidden meetings, it does not feel new. It feels like confirmation of something already suspected. Sources suggest that is entirely deliberate. These channels are not guessing. They are pattern matching to what has already worked, then deploying near identical titles simultaneously to flood search results and crowd out scrutiny. Nothing individually looks coordinated. Collectively, it is a system. So underneath all of this fabrication, what is actually shifting inside the monarchy right now? Because here is the thing. Strip away the midnight timestamps, the invented decrees, the manufactured crisis, and something genuinely significant is still happening inside the British monarchy right now. Sources suggest the real story is actually more interesting than anything those channels invented. Start with the Regency Act. There are active, documented legislative conversations about whether the 1953 framework is still fit for purpose. The act was written for a different era, a different family structure, and a very different understanding of what a prolonged royal health situation looks like. Those conversations are real, they are happening, and Catherine's expanded Counselor of State role sits directly inside that debate. Now, what the fabricated videos are mimicking, badly, is a genuine institutional recalibration. Since 2024, Catherine's solo engagements have increased in number, in weight, and in constitutional proximity to functions that matter. Her confirmed Counselor of State duties are not ceremonial decoration. They are documented succession, adjacent preparation, quietly accelerating in plain sight, and the palace is deliberately allowing that visibility to build, not through emergency decrees signed at midnight, through scheduling decisions, institutional appointments, and through the slow accumulation of public trust that actually constitutes real power inside a constitutional monarchy. Charles's cancer diagnosis genuinely changed the internal calculus. That part is not invented. What changed is not a document handing Catherine a symbolic object. What changed is timeline pressure on transition planning that was already underway, now moving with more urgency and less patience for delay. The Regency Act conversations, if they resolve into actual legislative reform, would be the real version of what those channels were pretending had already happened. A formal, documented, Gazette-published shift in how authority flows when a sovereign cannot fully exercise it. That is the story, not a decree. A framework, built over years, not signed at midnight. So, the question worth sitting with is not whether Catherine has already been handed some emergency power. She is not. The question is whether the institution is quietly, deliberately building the architecture so that when formal transition does come, the ground is already prepared. Sources suggest it is, and that is a story that does not need fabrication to be worth watching. The decree doesn't exist, but Catherine's gravitational pull on royal power is completely real. Whatever Charles actually signed or didn't sign, the loose end is this: someone briefed that story. Why? That question doesn't close.